There's a little queen on the animated screen. Wait till you get a view of sweet Betty. Made of pen and ink, she can win you with a wink. Wait till you get a view of sweet Betty. Those eyes, that pretty nose, and oh, aside from this, she's got so much of those. If you want to see just a perfect little she, wait till you get a view of sweet Betty.
All right, and hey, my name is Zach, and this here is Evan,
How's it going?
and this is the first episode of the cartoon podcast. I don't think we've come up with a name yet.
I think the cartoon podcast works pretty well, actually.
Hopefully, no one else is using that.
All right. What are we going to be talking about today, Zach?
So, since this first episode, our inaugural episode, our pilot episode, as some may call it, today we're going to talk about animation. Now, that seems like a very broad topic.
Well, yeah, considering our podcast is called the Cartoon Podcast.
We're talking
So
about
it's
cartoon.
fairly broad. Where are we going to start?
We're going to start at the very beginning of cartoons. Now, before we really get into it, I'm going to say that for the sake of simplicity, we are not going to talk about all cartoons. We're only going to talk about American cartoons. And why do you think that is, Evan?
Well, if we were to talk about the outstretching aspects of animation that are, part of every culture, this would be a 5-hour adventure going into some very advanced parts of education that we probably don't have training in.
Yeah, and there's just so much you could talk about when it comes to animation.
You could literally talk about it for years. Years.
And there are classes in college dedicated simply talking about different cultures' animation, as you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, literally, you sit down and you watch cartoons, and then you talk about them. It's pretty awesome.
Yep.
But we're not going to touch on that today. We're going to be touching mainly upon Western animation, particularly American Western animation.
Yeah, and to start that off, really, we're going to go back to the very beginning, back to the old swinging 1900s, back when you can go pay a dime and go see the latest movie. And in that movie, what would you go and see before that movie started, Evan?
You would see these cheap little things, these little animations, these hand-drawn animations. They were very new at the time. They were very exciting. They were motion video that wasn't shot of real people. They were actually hand-drawn, frame by frame, which a frame is literally just a picture, and the pictures are played in sequence, and they move. And they were known as animations or cartoons.
Yes, and that's basically where it starts. Animation before was maybe you'd get comics that were frame by frame, by panel, or sometimes you get little flip books, which you can consider probably one of the first animations is little flip books that
definitely
that would give you like a little frame, a little scene.
You just flip through it, and it's a very tiny story. Probably somebody manages to catch a falling object or something, and that's the end of it. But yes.
It's here that we talk about one of the first major figures in animation, in Felix the Cat.
Yes, Max Fleischer.
Yes, Max Fleischer is one of the first people to really make a name through animation. He made several silent era cartoons and was one of the first people to integrate sound through his animation.
Yep.
Most notably through the infamous Betty Boop.
Yeah.
Who one of his earliest collaborations, or not earliest, one of the later collaborations, but one that really made
his most
him
prominent.
yeah, one that really made him the kind of name that he was an old Betty Boop cartoon with a jazz singer by the name of Cab Calloway.
Mm-hmm.
He did a few of them, and a very prominent one is The Old Man on the Mountain, which not only has his music integrated into it and as part of the storyline, but also has something else that we're going to talk about from this era as we move along into it. Is uh, I think the correct term is rotoscoping.
Rotoscoping, yes, it is. For those of you who don't know, which I'm going to assume is most of you, um, not to offend you, but rotoscoping is the process of, first of all, taking actual shot film, or at the very least, actual pictures, and you go over them. Basically, you place a tracing sheet over them, and you just draw over it, hand by hand, frame for frame, over the video. Max was actually one of the pioneers and original inventors of rotoscoping, and used it actually fairly extensively in a lot of his work.
Yes, and as we go on to early animation, we see a rise in one of the second biggest figures in animation at this time. One Mister, you may have not have heard of him, a little guy named Walt Disney.
Ah, yeah, he was a kind of a low end animator. He loved the idea of drawing, and really loved animated pictures, and really wanted to get into it. So he started building these tiny cartoons. Him and his girlfriend.
Yep, you get the early silly symphonies, introducing some characters like Donald Duck and Oswald the Rabbit, until he
Oswald the Lucky
finally
Rabbit.
say again.
Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Yeah.
Yeah, and but because of a little dispute with the studio he was working with, he ended up losing the rights to Oswald the Rabbit,
Hmm.
and in retaliation, he made a character that a lot of people know nowadays. And what's that character's name?
Mickey Mouse. That wasn't his first name though. I believe his first name was it Mortimer? I think it was Mortimer Mouse, and his girlfriend at the time didn't like the name and suggested Mickey instead, and it stuck with it.
Yep, first introduced in Steamboat Willie, as people have seen. Even nowadays, Steamboat Willie is still famously parodied whenever you have a cartoon
Yep.
talking about its early days. Usually they'll mention Steamboat Willie. I know in Simpsons when they talk about the early days of Itchy and Scratchy, they talk about
Steamboat Itchy.
Steamboat Itchy.
Yeah.
And really, that's just all reference back to these early Disney cartoons. And what a lot of people don't really know about this early era and why we're talking about them at the same time is that Fleischer and Disney is definitely not present nowadays, but Fleischer and Disney were on the same level.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they both kind of pioneered animation in its own respects, and you really have to give them, due course of respect, because these guys were literally shaping an industry. They weren't redefining an industry or reimagining an industry. This had never existed before, and they came in and they just killed it. They were so good at it. It's uncanny how well they adapted to this new industry.
And to bring up rotoscoping again, uh, a lot of people notice when you look up behind the scenes stuff for early Disney stuff, there are a lot of instances where you have large studios dedicated to recreating different scenes from
Oh
cartoons
yeah,
to the
definitely.
anime.
Where they'll set the soundstage up like a particular shot they want, and have the actual voice actors just act out the scene and film it.
Yeah, and people nowadays would consider that like lazy or kind of cheating. But back then, that was literally they were literally the first ones to do this.
Well,
They
they
didn't
had to do
have
it.
yeah, they didn't have a frame of reference.
They didn't have just the studio libraries of reference material that animators today go through. They literally had to go through and say, okay, how does it look when a person moves like this from this angle?
How does it look when a tiny little fairy picks up a giant pair of scissors and uses them?
I don't know. I guess we'll have to recreate it, and they did.
A lot of the Tinkerbell stuff was literally they had to create giant pieces of scenery that they would use. And what's interesting to note is a lot of the times they wouldn't even have models doing the things. Whereas nowadays you would have this is basically a lot of people consider rotoscoping to be the forefather of today's
Motion capture.
And nowadays you have two different actors in that case. You would have the motion capture actor and you would have the voice actor.
Yep.
Back then, Disney would use the voice actors as the motion capture actors.
That way, in case the scene played out particularly well, because they would be miking them at the same time. They'd actually literally have them act out the full scene, and if it worked, that's the audio that they would use.
An interesting
note time and was very effective.
Interesting note is that exact thing happened when they did Alice in Wonderland. They had mic'd I don't remember the actor's name, but the one who played the Mad Hatter. They had mic'd him throughout the entire thing, and they ended up using the audio from the motion session. And Fleischer and Disney were on the same level, and there could be an argument made that back then, at least through the 20s to the 30s, Fleischer might have actually been a bigger name.
Well, definitely. I mean, he was creating, a good amount of the characters at the time. We had Betty Boop. We had Felix the Cat. I don't know if he was involved in. Yeah, Popeye the Sailor Man. He was part of too. He also did the old the Superman cartoons. He was kind of a titan at the time, like a huge part of the industry. But we don't talk about him a whole lot today because a lot of what he created has been sold off or belongs to other studios, whereas Disney is still, a centralized company.
Yes, and and I say that he was a bigger name because when you really compare it, especially by stipulations nowadays, who would you consider probably the bigger person? The one that only makes his own work, or someone who is trusted with a very, very big trademark, which of course comes
like Superman.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, and that's a lot of that also has to do with the fact that Fleischer was active long before Disney even began, his part in the industry. I'm sure Disney actually learned quite a bit from him.
And yeah, they were definitely like very respectful opponents at the time.
Oh, definitely. Well, I mean, okay, we talk about Steamboat Willie, right? We talk about the aspects of Steamboat Willie, the motion and how everything in it dances. That was Fleischer's trademark because he was working right at the time when animation was becoming a lot cheaper and easier to produce. And you had people in there who were trying to get, as much into the universe and the stories as they could. So they basically gave everything in their personality. And it was helping the industry to grow a lot because it was fun to watch. And Disney took that and put it in Steamboat Willie and a lot of his cartoons because that was it at the time. They played off of each other very well.
Yeah, and they were on the same level for a while. But what really kind of started the scales to tip was the release of the first ever full-length animated film by Disney.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It changed the game. Nobody was thinking that this would work, and it was a huge success.
I can't look it up right now, but didn't like production of Snow White cause them basically to go into bankruptcy?
I don't know if it caused them to go into bankruptcy, but he was pulling money from anywhere he could to get it done. Like he was, from what I understand, pretty tied up during all of it.
Definitely, but it was basically one of the biggest risks you could make, and if they hadn't made that risk, animation would probably be a much different place nowadays.
It was also the first film to be shown in full Technicolor, which is really cool.
Yes.
At least the first, animated show.
Yes. So that really kickstarted the golden age, really, of it was already considered kind of a golden age, or nowadays it is, because of the Mighty Mouse and the Woody Woodpecker and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But that really kickstarted what many people would consider the modern day golden age, and that's when it just exploded. That's when you have
Everybody was doing it. Everyone was trying to get in on it. It was a brand new market. It was the internet of the 1930s.
you have the intro of Warner Brothers, of MGM. You have Chuck Jones. You have Tex Avery, who are entering the game now, with the Bugs Bunny, with Daffy Duck, with uh, where's some other good examples?
Well, okay, you guys know how every old cartoon has the wolf character
Yeah,
that howls at women. That was Tex Avery. That was his invention. That was his signature. That's probably his most well-known cartoon to date.
yeah, and the Big Bad Wolf.
Yep.
That's the famous. That's probably one of the more parodied cartoon antics in modern day.
Yep.
The excited to see a woman or man nowadays acting up as a wolf based on the old Big Bad Wolf cartoon. You have the introduction of the modern day Looney Tunes at this time.
Which, oh my god, it was so different from anything presented at the time because cartoons up to that point had been there were some of them that may have done some twisted stuff, but for the most part they were very low key, fun loving, friendly stuff. And dude, old Looney Tunes are just crazy.
Yes,
Like they are off the wall.
and really to talk about Looney Tunes, we have to mention at this time that Fleischer had really started to fall out of fame. He was still doing stuff. I'm pretty sure at this time, either him or his family were still doing stuff at this time, but they had kind of fallen behind Walt Disney, and at the time Disney really had no competition.
Well, I mean, he was making, films like every 10 years or so. He was building an empire, and he was doing it very smartly. So a lot of the other animation gurus in the industry were kind of falling behind because a lot of them weren't focusing on that. They just thought it was too hectic and cost too much money.
Yeah, and another part of it was the fact that not only were they the powerhouse, because they were at the time basically making a monopoly in the animation industry, they could kind of spell their own rules, and their rules were it will be clean. Everything that they make will be very, very clean and very, very by the books.
Yep.
They had very strict rules on what could and could not be featured in their cartoons. They had very strict rules on how they would be animated, how certain characters would be portrayed, kind of like how they are nowadays.
Yeah.
They were very strict in what they do, and the answer to that ended up being the Looney Tunes type cartoon, because they were the ones that were really racy. They were the ones that took chances. They were the ones that actually decided to make a statement against Walt Disney, and that's kind of where they started. They were basically the just the modern day answer to, or not.
Well, I mean, Tex Avery was kind of a bastard, man. He was all about making fun of everyone else, and the best way to do that was literally to take these well constructed, by the books, very well paced cartoons and just put them on the biggest drug rushes that they've been on.
Exactly.
And we get just these crazy archetypes out of it that were just wildly different and very, very inviting.
Yeah, and also another big thing of it was established by Snow White and carried on to that was the sense of realism in cartoons. They would use a lot of rotoscoping. They would use a lot of very human-like actions and ways of doing. Your Sleeping Beauties, your Cinderellas, and stuff like that. They'd be very human characters with some cartoony aspects to it, but they would very much be animated versions of reality.
Animated versions of people, yeah, basically.
And so the Looney Tunes and stuff like that decided, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to literally have them be as cartoony as possible.
Yep. And it worked.
And yeah,
that was different.
And that actually, I think, what really changed it. They basically said, we're going to do this, and we're going to go against Disney. And eventually they stepped ahead of the times.
Yep.
And they basically had to spell out to Disney that if you want to keep up, you have to keep up with us.
Yep.
And that,
I mean, they invented the future which
Yeah.
is very hard to do in that kind of industry where the people who are, the titans are making all these decisions that are coming into play and becoming literally the core of the industry. So you come in and say, I'm not going to do any of that. And it changes everything. And that's hard to do. And I mean, it literally blew the
Yeah.
doors wide open for everything that followed.
Yep. And around this time we also had the upbringing of another major thing that really affected the industry, and that was television.
Yes.
Television probably was one of the biggest things to change it because at this point, Looney Tunes, Tex Avery, Disney, all of them were theater pieces,
Yeah.
especially during wartime. They would be pieces that would play in front of theaters. In the late 30s and early 40s, they'd be selling war bonds.
Yep.
And even
And
after that,
they would advertise in the middle of it too, interestingly enough.
yeah, and there's a lot of in advertising and in these cartoons, and yeah, they're mostly just theater pieces that played before major films.
Yep.
So around around the 50s, around the 50s and 60s, and some in the later 40s, they started to port cartoons over to the television screen.
Well, I mean, the television, man, it didn't just change cartoons, it changed everything. Because I mean, you have theaters and everything, which have movies that play for them, but that's as you produce them, you put them out. Now that you have theater, now that you have television, you have people rushing to produce content constantly. People are taking chances on anything that comes about, and you see animation and television, just film companies rise and fall left and right. It was a minefield industry.
Because at this point, they at this up to this point, you had to create a 5 to 10 minute short
Hmm.
that would definitely play and people would definitely see it because they
Yeah,
would be played in front of movies that people would go watch because
yeah,
that was the only alternative. You go watch a movie, you go to theater,
yeah.
and that was your outside entertainment. But then you have cartoons where suddenly you could have a consistent play.
Yeah, and you
You,
have to make sure that it's something that continuously grabs the audience, because if so, they can just flip over to another channel.
yes, and this was an example that affects a lot of television was competition.
Yeah,
With movies, you could possibly go see a movie that had only a limited playtime, but several movies would be in and out of theaters,
yeah,
and you could go back and maybe watch one if you missed one the first time, and that's the same with cartoons. With this now, though, if something doesn't catch the viewer's attention, then they're just going to change the channel, and you lose viewership, you lose advertising money, and your studio could go under.
and this is before syndication, so there's not a likelihood that they'll ever see that ever again.
Yes. So you would have so around the 60s you would have the rise of cartoon production companies that were now specifically made for television because
Yep.
you need dedicated hands to just making new content on a semi-weekly basis.
And who's one of the most well-known of those companies?
Well, a little company started by two people, one by the name of William Hanna and the other by the name of Joseph Barbera,
Yep.
uh, creators of Tom and Jerry, which is one that I'm pretty sure started in theaters but ended up becoming a TV mainstay.
Hmm. And what do you think is their most popular show from this time?
From this time, like I said, probably Tom and Jerry. But
Hmm.
one thing that Hanna Barbera really brought to the television screen and to animation in general, for better or for worse, was the fact that they brought forth cheaper animation.
Exactly. Well, I mean, and this is the joke from one of their most famous cartoons, the Flintstones, the repeated backgrounds for the running scenes and
Yeah.
things of that
So
nature.
so studios like this, when they learn that basically that they can't really put as much time into their animation as they could before because they no longer have these months and months and months of production time for one cartoon. Now they suddenly have to make an entire season of cartoons in a very, very limited time.
Yeah. Well, I
So
mean,
there,
and people were. It certainly wasn't a foreign idea to reuse animation cycles. We saw that back in the Fleischer era with the dancing light post cycles and that noise. But this was about saving costs and particularly saving time. It was an entire different reason that it happened.
and because of that, you would have the introduction of what would end up becoming mainstays in a lot of cartoons for a long time.
Yeah.
Up, and,
Oh,
up to like
definitely.
up to like the 90s, and even sometimes today, you would have the mainstays of the repeating background, the reuse of certain animation cells, uh,
Yeah.
and and really the use of catchphrases too. That saved costs on writing because you could throw in a certain cliches and you could save up a few seconds.
Well, I mean,
Uh,
and there are times when it was used effectively, like in the Flintstones, I counted as being used effectively. There are times when it was pulled down to really its like rawest form and just awful. Like if have you seen the old Clutch Cargo
I,
uh shows? It's literally it's still frames like being pulled across a background, and like when the characters speak, it's a picture of their face, and you have like an actual superimposed image of a real human mouth
oh
that's
yes,
just
I
talking.
actually do. I've seen clips of that.
And that was it at just at its most boiled down form, and it's very surreal to watch. That was definitely, I think, more on an aspect of the negative side. I know many animators agree that that's probably the worst that animation has ever
Yeah,
been.
and at this point, it's considered a decline of animation
Yes.
because just in general, there was now we have to make this we have to make this for a market that is now bigger and more competitive.
Yeah.
Because now there are multiple channels, and a lot of them are being played at the same time. So now we have to take stuff. We have to make more stuff so that we can take viewers away from them.
Yeah. We had to put in a lot more work into it, and a lot of people, kind of lost it going
Yeah.
through it.
Now there are several companies that I don't even know the name of because they're gone.
Yeah, they were there for maybe a month, maybe a year if they were lucky, and then they just disappeared. Now
And
to be fair, there are quite a few things that we got out of this that worked really well. Like during the 70s, we got Scooby Doo, which used pretty much all of the big animation mistakes in it, but still held its own and is still around today. But
yeah,
just as easy was it for a company to just fall over and die, even if they had a good idea, even if they had a dedicated team. It
and
was
some
it was anybody's market.
and sometimes there's stuff on the opposite end. You'd have oh, what is that cartoon I hated? Jabberjaw. I hated that cartoon.
Yeah, yeah.
Jabberjaw and there's this one cartoon about talking like Buggy.
Oh yeah, it's Speed Buggy,
Speed
I
Buggy. I
think.
hated that one too.
Oh yeah, gotta go. Well, I mean,
But
but that was the idea at the time, was that you just it became almost sitcom-y,
yeah,
kitschy, like TV shows where you had to have some sort of mascot character
yeah,
that went
and it
around.
basically became so cutthroat to the point where like you would just go like you turn on like producers would turn on TV and see what's popular and just call up people and say, "I want you to make this."
Oh yeah,
You would have literally people going, "I want you to go out and make Scooby Doo."
yeah.
I
It's the
want
reason that we have so many cartoons, even within Hanna-Barbera itself, that's so similar, because they have several teams working on the same idea tweaked slightly to see which one was successful. That's why we get Muttley and Huckleberry Hound
and
and Yogi Bear.
and uh and of course you would have the culmination of all those, the wacky races.
Exactly, because they could do that because they own they
They
owned
owned
all of
them
them.
all. so so what I will say about this was probably from the 60s to the 80s that this
Yes.
all started happening. And what really came from that was that there was a bit of a revolt to it. There were animators that looked at this and said, "This is crap.
Oh yeah.
What what people are making right now are crap." And you would get the rise of the adult animation at that time too.
Exactly. And this is when the idea of adult themes in animation really took off and became its own industry, really. This is really when it happened, because there had been stuff before, but it was never, you know, popular enough to make an entire sub industry out of, and this is when it really clicked and happened.
And I will
This is when we
say,
get Ralph Bakshi and people like them.
yeah, the Ralph Boschke's, what am I thinking of? The Don Bluth
Yes.
started to really rise during this time, and really talented animators were kind of stuck in this era where they would make quality work and be surrounded by just stuff that you make on a dime.
Yep.
And so, and as we get into the 80s, we get another thing that's really started to clog up the airways beyond stuff like the Hanna-Barbera reuse, and that is the rise of the commercial cartoon,
Yep.
where you would get your GI Joes, your Transformers, a lot of them being
Shows designed to sell toys to kids.
yes, and during this era, you would have like, because they started to notice that, well, there's no rule that says that these shows can't have advertising in the middle of it.
Yep.
So why not just make a show where we say, like, you like this character on this screen here? Buy the toy. Buy all
Do
the
it.
toys.
Do it now. Then you can make your own adventures with them. And it was mad successful, dude. It was so big.
It's so big that they had to make laws about what advertising cartoons can be.
What you're allowed to do with them.
Yes, and that also came with the education laws, which didn't make a big impact, but gave us modern day probably one of the biggest jokes in modern day cartoons, which is the PSA.
Yep.
A lot of the GI Joe PSAs were played around
I
that
know.
time.
And knowing is half the battle.
Yep. And of course, the two big ones are GI Joe and Transformers, but it's not only boys that had to deal with the advertising cartoons, though. This is the rise of the My Little Pony era.
Exactly.
The Barbie.
The My Little Pony, the strawberry shortcake.
Yes. Rainbow Bright too.
To a lesser extent, maybe.
To a
But
lesser
yes,
extent,
definitely.
but it's still its own cartoon and its own line of toys.
Definitely, yeah. Its own independent company. And the Cabbage Patch Kids, which was terrifying. Oh my god.
Absolutely awful. But yeah, this era really was just like this is what a lot of people consider to be the bottom of the barrel. You have the cartoons like Scooby Doo, which I think by the 80s was on its fourth series, and it introduced characters like Scrappy Doo.
Yeah, which was no.
Yeah.
That is shticky beyond even a level that Scooby Doo had ever been, and Scooby Doo was shtick.
Yeah, and it sucked for things like Disney too, because Disney was starting to for like the only time in Disney's long career, it started to flounder.
Yeah.
Because theatrical cartoons had started to waver away because the TV was introduced.
Oh yeah, dude. This was literally the death of Disney, and this was right before the resurgence of Disney, which happened in all of our lifetimes. Thankfully, we actually got to be there to see it happen.
Yes, definitely. You have because at this time, like theatrical films and feature-length animated movies were not the thing anymore because you could go home and watch cartoons on TV. Why would you go to a theater and watch these? They don't have big name actors in them. They don't have your and this shows my ignorance of old time actors, but
Burt Reynolds.
They don't have your Burt Reynolds in it. Your Cindy Crawford. Your
just anybody who was big at that time.
Yep.
They just weren't. They weren't part of it. It was.
It almost got the end for Disney if it weren't for the fact that in the late '80s, early '90s, they started to actually do stuff. They started to actually basically say, we need to do something different. We need to take ourselves out of it. And some people consider that to be the real turning point for it to be Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Yeah. Well, Who Framed Roger Rabbit reunited a lot of the old giants and said, guys, we've had, a lot of really awful things happen to us in the past couple decades, but we are really dedicated to making this a good film and to make it a great animation piece. And everybody pulled together on that project.
Yep. It was considered the only time you ever see the collaboration of Tom Jones and
Chuck Jones.
Chuck Jones, sorry. I always say Tom Jones when I think about him. Where you have collaboration of Chuck Jones and Walt Disney
Exactly.
into one film. Because at the time, because when they were really creating stuff, they were the biggest opponents after Fleischer kind of disappeared.
Yep.
So to see like Daffy and Donald in the same scene was pretty amazing.
It was crazy. Not to mention Mickey and Bugs during the ending scene inside of Toontown.
But there are other people that also started to take notice that this era of animation was bad. One of
Yeah.
the major ones being Steven Spielberg. As
Oh yeah.
late 80s, early 90s, was one of the people to kind of bring in a new type of animation by collaborating with Warner Brothers to make some really quality cartoons.
Oh, definitely. Well, this is
From-
this is the era of Animaniacs and Pinky
Yeah.
and the Brain, which really helped flesh out the ideas that kids programming can still be quality programming, and changed how people looked at cartoons in the industry a lot.
Absolutely. So so basically, to kind of give a framing area, this is I'd say like early 90s, and
Mhm.
you've just had 2 decades of just and basically this is how we explain it nowadays, just crap.
Just bad. Yes, exactly.
Like you have 2 decades of reused animation, really cheap sell stuff, and
And
just
selling toys and Thundercats.
yes, and just stuff that just was not good. So they basically said, so we have some people that now had grown up in that era who are now going, I think I could do better. And one of them being Steven Spielberg, who was an active filmmaker during that era,
Hmm.
making live action films, of course.
Well, building an extensive empire.
Yes, he basically said, well, I think I could do better, and he did.
He did. Yeah, he owned up to it.
And not only did he make good comedy cartoons at the time, he also later in the 90s would be one of the people to introduce a probably one of the first serious cartoons in a long time, which is the introduction of Batman, the animated series.
Hmm.
There have been several attempts earlier to make a Batman cartoon, and they all kind of flourished.
Yeah.
And they usually didn't work. And this is coming right off the success of the Tim Burton.
The Tim Burton Batman film, yes, from the late 80s, I believe, 89.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah. And at this point, Warner Brothers was actually pretty much exploding. They were doing really well.
Yep,
And they
and
were like, "We need to ride this. What are we gonna do?" So they hired a bunch of animators and were like, "Okay, guys, what can we do? You've worked with Disney on some of their newer films, which have been really good. Make us something."
yep,
And they
and
gave us Batman the Animated Series.
gives them the animated series and Animaniacs and Tiny Toons and from that end, Warner Brothers really helped define what changed from the 90s from the 80s, and
Yep.
that was crap too good. That's basically what happened. 80s were crap, 90s were good.
One of the really cool things that's happening at this time too in the background that a lot of people aren't aware of is that even back in the 70s, back way in the mid to late 70s is really when we begin to see the foundations of Pixar.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
during the 80s to the early 90s, they're producing all those shorts, the ones you see at the beginning of every Pixar film. And during the 90s, they make another stepping stone when they create the first computer-generated animated feature film, Toy Story.
Toy Story, which is probably my first major animated film that I saw in theaters.
Hmm.
So that's when we come on the scene.
My first was Aladdin in '92. I was 3 years old.
uh, so another thing that was kind of happening on the side too, as we mentioned, there were a lot of people that were raised in the era of bad, raised
Yeah.
in the 60s and 80s, who are now coming on. Were graduating from Cal Arts. We're now
Yep.
basically coming onto the scene, and there's one company that existed during that era called Hanna-Barbera that we mentioned earlier,
Hmm.
and at the time, and this is so I've talked with the person who did this. At the time, there was a man by the name of Fred Seibert who had worked with Cartoon Network, who had worked with Nickelodeon, and worked with MTV before for advertising,
And did a lot to actually help those companies really flourish in the market, or in the case of MTV, create an entire market.
and so at this time, after meeting with a friend, he ended up gaining the ownership of Hanna-Barbera, which had started to flourish in and of itself because after 20 years of just making bad shows, people started to take notice.
Yep.
And so he went in there and basically, and he didn't know what to do with the company, so he did the only thing he thought was smart. Get rid of all the old stuff, especially he was one of the big haters of the last era. He's even said to me that he hated Scooby Doo.
Oh yeah,
He absolutely just
because
despised.
it was doing everything wrong.
Yeah, and so he said, "We're going to get rid of all that. We're going to go to these young adults that are just graduating from CalArts, and we're going to let them just show what they got."
We're gonna let them try stuff out and put it out there.
Yep, and he made some of the first compilation shows like What a Cartoon and Random Cartoon, whose entire purpose was to show these shorts that people over at CalArts had made.
To make new shows, to display new ideas, and we got some great animators out of them.
And he got some very original shows that had a very different look. A lot of the 70s and 80s had almost the exact same look to them because they were all being made by the same company for the exact purpose. When you come to this era, you have a lot of cartoons that look completely different from one another.
Oh yeah,
Powerpuff Girls look different from Ed, Edd n Eddy. Courage the Cowardly Dog was different from Johnny Bravo.
Johnny Bravo was entirely different from Cow and Chicken.
Yep, and they're all very different shows, very different animated, and very differently written.
But
and
they're all held under one company.
Yep, and so you would have the resurgence of animation, but there is another this coin which had the Warner Brothers and the kids cartoon side.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, this coin had another side, which is weird because coins only have two sides.
Probably you should use a triangle for this analogy.
Maybe that'll work. So you have another thing that's happening at the exact same time, and this is really why this era became so big, and we don't even have a name for this era yet. You would have in the late 80s the premiere of one of the biggest cartoons not for kids. Mm-hmm. Adult animation had really come up in the 70s, but no major things had come from it until now, where you have the first show that was actually like for adults and not really for kids, and was actually played at prime time, and that is, of course, The Simpsons. The premiere of The Simpsons was in the late 80s, but really came to prominence in the early 90s.
Yep.
When it was first given its own show, and was really just like the first show that just did what it wanted to do.
Well, and it played a lot of things really, really smart in how it differentiated itself from kids' cartoons. Because kids' cartoons at this point were still very fantasy-oriented. They were absurdist. They didn't have a whole lot of truth and reality to it. And The Simpsons was crazy. It was wacky, but it was based on the idea that these could be real people.
Yeah.
Living somewhere, and this is how their lives play out.
Yep, and especially in a lot of the earlier seasons, it was played very much to a realistic aspect.
Yep.
You can almost say it was called back to the realism era of the 30s to 50s.
Exactly.
Where you would have, like, they may have been cartoony, but the way that they acted were very real.
Well, it was almost a parody of it, in essence.
It was basically the parody of the cartoons that had brought us to that point. And, yeah, it basically spelled out that, and of course, at the same time, you'd have these cartoons that were being premiered as cartoon shorts, being picked up for full shows over on the kids' side. But then the people making those would also be kind of in the gray area when it comes to writing as well.
Exactly.
one thing that not a lot of people really know about the 90s and 2000s is that there's one thing that died during that era that a lot of people know because not a lot of people really study animation, and that was the death of traditional animation.
Hand-drawn animation, which is thankfully making a small resurgence now, but it is very important to study the time that it was not there because digital animation was becoming so much easier.
Yeah,
It's
it
becoming
became
so much easier to produce.
yeah, and I think because of traditional animation and stuff like that, you would have a rise of shows that Simpsons kind of opened the door for.
Hmm.
Uh, very closely related ones being stuff like The Critic, which had premiered during that time.
Hmm.
Uh, well, later in the decade, but still around that time.
It's still
But
it's an aspect of that era, yes.
another adult show that I think really cemented the adult aspect of cartoons, and I think because really, if you want something to stick around, you can't only have one thing. If you can't only have The Simpsons to be the only example. And thankfully, what really cemented adult animation, I think, was the premiere of South Park in the late '90s.
Yes.
And I think South Park would not have lived if it weren't for the fact that digital animation had become a lot more prominent. By the second or third season, they had the ability to now make their entire show on computers.
Yep.
Whereas
Well, I mean, and
before,
a lot of it, like the first animated short that we saw of South Park was, done entirely with that construction paper gimmick, which I'm sure was mind-bendingly annoying. But a lot of the first few seasons were kind of a mix between, the actual shooting and then the digital manipulation. But then soon they had completely perfected the idea of creating that digital empire, which allowed them to produce that show for really cheap and really fast too. I mean, they make it in what, 6 days?
yes, there's a there's a documentary now online that you can go watch called 8 Days to Air, which shows the production of a single episode of South Park. Started on Wednesday after the last episode aired, and finished on the Tuesday before the next episode was supposed to air on the
Yeah.
Wednesday. And they'd really gotten it down to just a pat, and that was all thanks to computer animation. Uh, and with that, and I mentioned earlier that a lot of kids cartoons at this time were starting to become like a lot more adult. They
Yeah.
were still aimed a lot towards kids and had a lot of jokes that kids would get, but you would have some adult jokes in there too.
Well, I
And
mean,
I
you look
mentioned
at
that,
like Johnny Bravo or Animaniacs, and those things are riddled with adult humor. We need to
yes,
look for fingerprints. I found him. No, 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 fingerprints. Not on your life.
life. But one of the main reasons I mentioned that is because another prominent figure rose out of those kids cartoons. A writer who at the time had only been known for working on shows like Dexter's Lab and Johnny
Hmm.
Bravo,
Yep.
took his idea that he had pitched as a what was the original cartoon called?
I don't remember, but it was one of the Oh Yeah cartoons.
Yeah, one of the Oh Yeah cartoon pitches was made to a full show uh, called Family Guy, made by
Yep.
McFarlane.
Seth MacFarlane, who was not he was fairly well known in the industry at this time, having invented ideas like Johnny Bravo and written for episodes of Dexter's Laboratory and Johnny Bravo, but he became an overnight name with Family Guy.
Yes, exactly. And then and around this we start to get into what is the modern era. After
Exactly.
2000, you would have the Simpsons, which had been going on for a decade at that point. You have Family Guy, which was a new commodity. You'd have around 1999 was the premiere of Futurama, which was the
Yep.
second show by Matt Groening. On the adult end, you have a lot of shows that were basically starting to make this own little niche in the market.
Exactly.
On the kids end, you have the rise of Nickelodeon, Cartoon Network, and Disney. Disney had for a while now been making its own market in kids entertainment. You'd have Ducktales, Tailspin,
Yeah.
Darkwing Duck, and stuff like that, which had its own following. And so around this time, you would have this gigantic collection of just cartoons
Yeah.
because Nickelodeon would have its own cartoons. It would have its Rugrats, its Fairly Odd Parents, on Cartoon Network, you'd have the shows made by Hanna-Barbera. And a lot of what Cartoon Network is known for came from the image of Hanna-Barbera.
Yeah.
Especially, I think
Well, I
even
mean, Hanna-Barbera basically defined whatever Cartoon Network used.
yeah,
That basically became the cornerstone of every one of their lineups.
and like around this time, you also have the real prominence of Saturday morning cartoon, where you
Yep.
have cartoons basically made just to be played on Saturday morning,
Exactly.
along with importing cartoons from other countries. So at this time, it was almost too much because you could turn on a day of television, and from beginning of that day to the end of that day, watch nothing but cartoons playing.
Dude, that changed. I remember when I was a kid, man. Because I mean, all we had what was it? We had channel, it was like 31 or something that played cartoons in the morning. I would get up and I would watch like Garfield and Friends. I would watch Power Rangers, and that was all there. And then after that, it was just boring old people shows. Then my dad got cable, and I'm sorry, a channel that has cartoons 24 hours a day.
Yeah,
I lost my shit, man.
on Saturday, you could get up and watch Saturday morning cartoons, and once that's over, you can go on a Cartoon Network and Nickelodeon and watch new cartoons all
Watch
day.
everything
And then you
forever.
could watch the primetime cartoons like Family Guy, like Simpsons. And then at night,
Exactly.
you could watch the late night cartoons, which is prominent by things like Toonami, who would play very late night cartoons. And it just became too much. And nowadays, you're seeing the death of Saturday morning cartoons.
Yep.
Unfortunate, but it kind of had to happen.
Well, and honestly, it gave us something better out of it in the end. That's the beautiful thing. Then, right around the mid 2000s, that first decade, we had kind of a lull. I mean, we started getting shows that were because it was Flash was around now.
Yeah,
Macromedia had just been bought out by Adobe, and Flash was this big new thing, and we started getting shows like Yakety Yak that were just that were just bad. They were quickly and cheaply produced, and they were not good. And
Flash animation by many is considered the second coming of the cheap animation that was popular in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Because now you could literally go and buy a commercial Flash animation program for less than $100 at the time.
Yeah.
And make your own cartoon.
And make your own show. And to be fair, Flash is a great program when it's applied correctly, but nobody did. Nobody cared to. It was all about getting that stuff out fast and filling it up and getting in on the animation boom again. And then eventually that people, got all their complaints out about that, and it kind of died, and we started getting quality shows again. Yeah. And thankfully, there was never enough of a lull, I think, to really end the era and start a new one. So we're still really kind of in the redawn of animation.
Yes, and a lot of people have tried to come up with a name for this era. They've called it the second golden age. They've called it the new renaissance of animation. And I said earlier before we started, what I consider this era to be is the culmination era. We've had at this point a century of animation up to this point.
Yep.
And because of that, you can look at modern day cartoons, and every cartoon you can see a culmination of what we had up to this point to now. I could look at Adventure Time and see a lot of the Fleischer animation style brought into that. I could look at Avatar: The Last Airbender and see a lot of early Disney realism animation brought into that.
It's finally the opportunity for us to use our culture, our heritage, because animation now is old enough to be its own culture that's defined its own, generations and generations in a society. Yes, and we're finally able to use that and advance it.
And thanks to the international, there's no international barrier now because of stuff like the internet. So now you have cartoons that have premiered nowadays, like Avatar, like Teen Titans, and cartoons like that who are very heavily based on Japanese animation. Mm-hmm. But then you have shows from other countries. One of my favorite animated movies that had premiered a few years ago was a movie called Persepolis.
Persepolis, I loved Persepolis.
which is a French animation, I believe.
It is. Yes, it is French. It is based off of the comic written by the French Iranian woman who the story's about.
Yeah, and
And it's gorgeous.
it's a very gorgeous movie. And so we're going to go ahead and end out here. But before we end out, I do want to just point out a few things. First off, I want to just name some of the major figures in animation at this time, or not
Yep.
even at this time, throughout time.
All right.
Have Max Fleischer and Dave Fleischer, who are the creators. You have Walt Disney, who are the first ones. Those are the two big ones.
Mhm.
After that, you have Chuck Jones and Tex Avery, who were the rebels, basically.
Mhm.
From there, you have Hanna and Barbera, who unfortunately came and defined a different era. Came to define the cheap era, and then you have people like Fred Seibert. You have Matt Groening, Seth MacFarlane, who came to define the modern era, and along with them, to a lesser extent, you have like the Jenny Tartovsky and Craig McCracken,
Very much so.
who are also major ones. And I will go ahead and say now, we are just looking at the very, very top surface of what animation is right
Oh
now.
yeah.
We have skipped over so much through this history just because we do not have the time to look into them. And of course, future podcasts, we're going to be looking into them a lot during the later era. We had the imports of anime into the United States that really defined cartoons. You have the rise of Adult Swim, which we didn't really get into, and how that affected adult animation.
Yep.
So
Pretty extensively, actually.
yeah, so thanks for joining us. I hope this wasn't too much for a rambling first episode.
See you guys next time.
I'll see you guys next time. I've been Zach.
I've been Evan.
Thank you all for joining us.